Hello and welcome to ISFiT's plenary session, Controlling the Narrative. In a time of political turmoil, the continuous stream of information accessible to us through the media is a source of both knowledge and education on global issues facing the world. However, it may also have other implications and effects that must be taken into consideration. In our age of technology, anyone can access information directly from whatever source they wish. But if the way that information is presented is biased, how can this affect us as a society? How does the media present knowledge, and what responsibility do they have when they spread information? These are some of the questions we will discuss today. My name is Inga Mageli, and I will be today's moderator. We have three very interesting panelists with us today who soon will give us their introduction. But before we start, I will remind you that from where you stream, there will be a link available in the description where you can submit your questions to the panelists. So I encourage you to do so it won't only be my questions today, but also yours. First up of our panelists is Stefan Geiss. Stefan is an associate professor of sociology and political science at NTNU and has his research focus on agenda and frame setting, opinion formation, and seeking information as well as decision making in journalism. As an associate professor, Stefan has many years of experience within the area of when media affects the public and can give us an insight into the mechanisms behind the relation between media, society, and individual. Stefan, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Yes, I would like to show you a few theses. I try to wrap up some basic ideas I have from my work as a political communication and mass media scholar from the past years. What I was reflecting on is how to get an information environment that facilitates well-informed opinion formation of the public and appropriate debates about the most relevant issues facing society, which we probably all can subscribe to. Yes, first of all, one has to recognize, my first thesis, that this is an impossible task. And creating a relevant and appropriate picture of reality is not in all cases possible. We have to settle with not good but not optimal solutions and continuously evaluate and be critical. We should still try to optimize and safeguard the process and not stop short just because it's unachievable in perfect fashion. It's nowhere near optimal and it's never going to be. We have to tune down our expectations and hopes quite a little bit. My second thesis is that there's actually no way back. The journalism and news-based world constructions we were probably used to in the late 20th century, they were more or less an anomaly, I argue. And it's strongly tied to mass media and mass communication. It won't come back in that form, and maybe we even should not want to get it back. It has had its strength, but also severe limitations and relatively independently of individuals' good or bad intentions within the system, and we should make the best of what we are facing now. My third thesis is that we should not see the challenges facing the public sphere as grounds for delegitimizing scrutiny. Criticism and scrutinizing alternative news and fake news practices can and should not delegitimize criticism and scrutiny of the news media's practices. So there's many invalid criticisms against the news media found online, and they reflect a lot of misunderstandings of news media's routines and their imperfections, and also overly high expectations as to what the news media could achieve. But journalism itself, I argue, plays an important part in creating those overly high expectations and some of the misconceptions as well regarding journalistic routines. And there's some deficits in journalists' self-control practices as well, around the world, basically. And serious efforts of critical self-reflection are necessary to stop the alternative news universe from expanding. I also think it's important to defertilize the ground for demagogues in that attacks against and the drive to start alternatives to the news media, they reflect a widespread dissatisfaction with the news media, and it has surfaced more, become more visible, and got more momentum through online practices. But it has always been there at the bars and wherever. So news media should take that seriously and look for possibilities to cater to these demands, however incivil they are proposed in public. Just delegitimizing these criticisms opens the gates even wider for demagogues. We shouldn't be too scared of the metaphor of echo chambers and the phenomena associated with it. This is a real problem, but it has its limits, and it will not play out as it's often discussed in the public. Often it's more an expression of fragmentation that has already happened than a driver of ever more fragmentation. Also regarding ethics, my position is that goodwill isn't sufficient to steer public opinion formation. Media ethics alone won't change the game, and ethics will only be effective if they become a sort of law, written or unwritten, more likely unwritten laws. My seventh thesis is to calm down and don't panic. There is very widespread trust in the news media as an institution that is robust and resilient in many Western democracies. There are, of course, potential challenges, but we might even see it as chances to make democracy work better than ever before. And the US is probably more an exception to the rule than the rule, what we're seeing there. And my last thesis is that we need to put more focus on choosing the issues we're talking about wisely, because there's lots of issues competing for public attention and very little capacity to cover them in depth. So which issues really capture our societal attention for how long and with what consequences needs very careful consideration and reflection. Otherwise, we let a very scarce resource go to waste. And online environments are a particular challenge for these attention mechanisms. Yes, that's my thesis, and I'm finished with my basic introduction statement and looking forward to your questions and the discussion.
Thank you, Stefan. Our next speaker up is Jenny Westrum-Rein. Jenny is a journalist currently working for Nidraos, a local newspaper in Trondheim. And she's the former editor of the student newspaper here in Trondheim called Under Dusken. Jenny is experienced in both moderating and partaking in political debates. As a journalist and a former editor, Jenny can give valuable insight to the responsibilities and considerations both media platforms as establishments and journalists as individuals have to take into account when choosing and presenting knowledge to its audience. Jenny, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Wow, that was quite an introduction. We will see what we get up with. Controlling the narrative. I actually found the title of this discussion kind of funny. I work as a journalist in the local newspaper, Nidraos, as you now know, and we are a fairly new newspaper. We started out in January 2020. And if you ask any person in Trondheim, I don't think that they would say that I control their narrative. or even that Nidraos controls their narrative, or even that Adresseavisen or NRK controls their narrative. I think that they themselves think that they control their own narrative. What they think, what they are passionate about, and what they are opinionated about. An editor of mine once said that we have to give the readers three things. We have to give them what they want, what they think that they want, and what they need. And by that, we mean that the readers might think that they want to read something, but it's not always what they click when they visit our websites. And the things that they want to read are not always what they need to read. Just a few years ago, you could go to a newsstand and you would buy a newspaper and have the whole of reality in front of you. The newspaper decided what was important that day and what you should care about. You didn't have many other options. And at night, the whole country gathered around the famous campfire, Dagsrevyen. And sure, there were differences of opinion between the different media outlets, but for the most part, they at least agreed on what to disagree about. At that time, you could actually say that the media was controlling the narrative. The media served the audience a ready-made reality. And yes, in some ways, we still do. We choose what stories to print, what events to focus on, and who we want to be heard. But now you have these alternatives. You as an individual can choose which narrative you want to follow. You choose which newspapers you read, if any, what you watch on TV, when you watch it, and what information you want to perceive. When social media started to rise, many people saw it as this democratic opportunity. Finally, we were going to hear the voices of the minorities and the marginalized. But with social media came the comment section, and with the comment section, everyone could share their opinion with just a few clicks. The comment section seemed to reflect what real people thought, and it seemed that the media was out of touch, reflecting an entirely different reality. So we decided we had to take these comments seriously, and in that way, we expanded the range of which opinions we considered legitimate. Bjørn Kristoffer Bore in Vårt Land wrote an interesting editorial about this last weekend, where he pointed out several examples where Norwegian newspapers or other media outlets normalized and sometimes even established extreme voices, because they were used neutrally without contextualizing what they were saying or who they were. Bore claims that the media has been listening too much to the comment section and not enough to the people. And I think that is something that all journalists need to reflect on. Do the articles we write and the sources we choose actually reflect the opinion of the populace? Or does this actually enlighten the debate, or are we constructing disagreement where most people agree? I am, per definition, a Gen Z, and I grew up with social media. I was 12 when I made my Facebook account, 13 when Snapchat came into my life, and 14 when I began to post on Twitter or Instagram. But at the same time, I also had this fundamentally trust in traditional media. There were newspapers on the breakfast table, and I always trusted that media told the truth. Most people still trust people like me, journalists. That is an enormous privilege that we shouldn't take lightly. And I am incredibly grateful for the people that show me their trust every day, and who sometimes let me in on the most vulnerable moments of their lives. But there are also people that don't trust people like me. There are people who think that I will mislead them on purpose. And there are also people who think that I and other journalists deserve to be killed. When I watched the US Capitol being stormed in January, one picture stuck with me. Carved into one of the doors at the Capitol, murder the media. Today, what is politically acceptable to say is constantly pushing new boundaries in the name of free speech. However, not all these boundaries should be broken. The Capitol storming was just another proof that trolls do not, in fact, crack under daylight. I firmly believe that journalists have a huge societal responsibility and that we have to regain the trust of many people. But I don't think that we fulfill that responsibility by accepting a broader and more extreme range of opinions in the public debate. We do so by continuing to research public spending, by investigating investigative journalism, and by shedding light on matters unknown to the public. That being said, this is not isolated to a media problem or a problem with journalists, and I think that that is important to have in mind. These are challenges that we as a society face together, even though many of these problems are more present in other parts of the world. My colleagues are extremely dedicated and intelligent people who want to act as watchdogs, as we should, and we do in the interest of the population. But no matter how dedicated or good journalists they are, we are just people. We also make mistakes. And sometimes we have to look into those mistakes. We need to take a look at them, we need to learn from them, and we need to discuss them, as we're doing right now. So I would just like to thank ISFiT for inviting me, and I'm looking forward for the discussion.
Thank you for your introduction, Jenny. Our last speaker is Kjersti Løken Stavrum. Kjersti Løken Stavrum holds a degree in political science. She began her career working as a journalist in Aftenposten. Currently, she works as a CEO of the Tinius Trust, the largest stakeholder in Schibsted Media Group. Previously, she held the position of General Secretary of the Norwegian Press Association. And in 2020, she was announced as the leader of the Freedom of Expression Commission. Kjersti, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. And it was great listening to the two other introductions. I would like to start with the work of the Freedom of Expression Commission. It is the task that we've been given is huge and wide and encompasses everything of the internet and everything that we speak about and what we shouldn't speak about. But we are not the first Freedom of Expression Commission in Norway. We had a commission 20 years ago, which many will remember. And I find that interesting because I think there is a widespread opinion of proudness of the commission. And I am among those who think that they delivered tremendous work and a beautiful report on freedom of expression. And their main purpose was to make freedom of expression platform neutral. That is not only constrained to printing printed expressions. And I have two favorite examples from that report that was published in 1999. One of them is a reflection they have because they only relate to edited media, and one part says that imagine if all people could debate with each other, how messy wouldn't that be? And that is of course a reflection that seems logic when you haven't heard of or you have no imagination of what social media is about, because social media came 7-8 years later. But that is with the one reflection that I really enjoy from the report, and the other one is that they argued for removing a law that said it was prohibited to disseminate disinformation in society. They found that that law could sort of be a constraint to freedom of expression. It was no longer in use. Remember, this was after the Cold War, so that law was removed from Norwegian law, which is interesting since we today have another another angle to dissemination of fake news, disinformation. We find it troubling. We find it scary. We are afraid that it can sort of make harm to our democracy. But no, we don't have the law against it. And both of those examples I think, should remind us that it's extremely difficult to say anything about the future. And where we are right now in 2021, I think we have a debate on in a situation where the social media are about to become mature, but we don't really like what we see. We see the United States. We see how it has worked in a democracy that I think we sort of held up against our own democracy, and maybe confused the American democracy to our society. And we have had a situation where the edited media has been sort of spoken down or been criticized a lot, but these days they are sort of back on the stage again, because social media is not that perfect as we thought they would be a few years ago. So where does this bring us? I think I perfectly agree with Jenny saying that you cannot control the narrative. No one controls the narrative. And I also agree with the fact that we do think that we control our own narratives, which we don't. We are absolutely a lot influenced by the information we get. But it's much more interesting to look at who are today's opinion powers, who are influencing, who are the influencers on how opinions are being made. And that is, fortunately, in our society, much more complex, much more multiple than the edited media. It's much more multiple than the social media. And I do think that I heard of Clubhouse in a normal conversation with a friend, which should remind us that we get a lot of information from a lot of sources through the day. I do think that we are in a situation today where we are too focused on the negative parts of freedom of expression, which I find troublesome. I was born in the last century, and I have lived not for that long, I find, but I've probably lived half my life. And I know that freedom of expression has not been better than it is today. So that really depends on what you compare the situation of today with. And I'm afraid that we sort of think of a freedom of expression as an ideal situation where we are debating, where we are discussing, where we agree to disagree, and all those beautiful things. But that is not that is an utopia. We will never come there. It's not even sort of something we should achieve for. What we should be afraid of, though, is that we don't get the access to the information that we need to have a proper conversation among ourselves. And so when we speak of freedom of expression, we too often, I think, are focused on, am I to say what I want to say, much more than being afraid of me not getting access to the information I need. That being said, it has never been better, the access of information that we have today. The internet is fantastic, and the communication forces that are around in both public and private sector are generally, not always, but generally eager to distribute information and to bring information forward, which of course makes it easier for those who want to seek out facts. But still, I think that if I should sum up this small introduction, I will say that I will sort of warn or maybe say that we should be very aware of those postulates on the situation that seems catchy and easy to agree on. Like, for instance, we are so polarized, or that there are filter bubbles that some people seem to spend their days and lives within. I'm grown up in a small town outside Oslo, I think I grew up in a filter bubble, as we would describe it today. We subscribed to 2 newspapers and had access to Norwegian telly, but we also had access to Swedish television, which was very seldom in Norway at those days, but that was because I grew up close to the border of Sweden. So we were very much more informed, I think, than other people were at that time. But still, today, that would be like a very, very meager media consume if you compare it to these days. I think I will leave it there in the beginning, and I'm looking forward to the debate.
Thank you so much, Kjersti, and thank you all 3 of you for your introductions. I will remind the audience watching from home that you can submit your own questions to our knowledgeable panel here. So there should be a link available in the description at the Facebook event or at YouTube. So I want to start with kind of a broad question about how the media presents information. Because in a world where we have constant access to information about more or less any event happening around the world, how are decisions being made on what issues the media writes about? Stefan, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yes, I do. Try to keep it short. So there's different ways to analyze the issues media are publishing and the events media are taking up. One way of viewing it is trying to capture attributes these events share that get a high and positive response from the media in terms of covering it, not only somewhere, but on the front page, on the in a good visible space. So that would be things like how many people in society are affected. Are there any significant negative developments depicted? Any significant positive developments depicted? That all would contribute to having higher chances of getting a lot of attention from a lot of different news media. And the other tradition would focus on the decision-making process, either looking at individual journalists or at editorial teams more generally, and the processes through which these decisions are made. So these 2 traditions, is what science contributes there, and they both account for considerable variability. But there's also a lot of things that is not systematic along these 2 sources. So we would treat that as random, but certainly the journalists with a more practical insight can have more ideas on that, things that scientists typically disregard because it's too unsystematic.
Kjersti, do you have anything to add to that? I think you're muted.
I took away the hand, but I didn't unmute. Too much to think about. Well, I think the question invites to reflection on the fact that it, up until recently, was a very common force working among the edited media, that if there was one news outlet that had a newsworthy story, all the others followed up. That made it a huge force that it was impossible for politicians or whoever that were criticized to oversee. They had to relate to the criticism that was brought forward. Somewhere along the diminishing of the newsrooms, that stopped happening. More and more we see, and we've seen for some years already, that there are solo players with their own stories to follow. I think the first time I really recognized it was when Dagbladet had a breaking story on the Norwegian military that had sold equipment, boats to warlords in Nigeria. A shocking and true breaking story that led up to a hearing in the parliament. naturally, considering the aspects of the story and the depth and the criticism and everything. And no journalists came, only Dagbladet, to put it on. There might be a few others, but I know that the politicians were shocked that there were only so few that were interested in that story. So today it's much easier to overlook criticism, to get away with it, and you can say that the advantage is that you don't get this disproportionate sort of criticism and feeling that the media, or that you have all the media chasing you. That's a good thing. But the bad thing is that you don't neither get different angles to the coverage, because it's likely that the newsroom that has sort of brought the story up, they will stick to their version of it. But still, it's the fact that it's easier today to just let it pass.
Jenny, as a journalist in a local newspaper, do you think that you take other considerations when decisions are being made on what issues you write about compared to, let's say, national or international news?
Yeah, we absolutely do. As a local newspaper, the most important matter for us is, does people in Trondheim care about this? And if the answer is no, there's really few reasons for us to write about it. So we have to make like other decisions than we had to do when you're working at a national newspaper, an international one. The most important things for us is if this affects anybody in Trondheim. Does people talk about this? How does it affect them? How many does it affect? Is there anyone who wants to speak about this? And I think the biggest thing in a local newspaper is that almost anything can be a story. We could pick up cases that articles that are much smaller than you would prioritize in a bigger newspaper, which is also why the local newspapers are so important to people. Because we get close to them, we write about the things that they care about. Either it's the way that their kids walk to school, or it's about like a football game at the local field. So I think that's, yeah, we definitely take other matters and have other matters in our head when choosing stories. Though also a lot of the same appeals to us.
And we, yes, Stefan, I see that you have a comment.
Yes, I would like to follow up on that, and it's interesting. Of course, you're speculating and thinking about what will my audience want and ask for, and how you get come to terms with that. So what kinds of indicators you have, or what kind of intuitions you're using to judge, because you don't have a try out, a demo audience to play. Is that a story for you? And they'd say yes or no. Right, so that's the second guessing of what the audience, which is a large mass of individuals, might want or not. So that's an interesting process for us researchers in this. Yeah, is it about clicks? Is it about intuition? What's do you use any indicators for that?
Yeah, Jenny, would you like to follow up on that?
Yes, I would say it's both. It's both clicks and intuition. Most of the people here have worked in newspapers for a long time. We know what stories go, what stories don't. And also it's kind of this, we know what people want to have, and then it's the mix. We have to give them what they want, what they need, what they think they want. So some days you must write about a thing that a lot of people are talking about on social media. And we know that that story is going to hit in that area. And sometimes we have to write about news that's happening in Trondheim because it's important, political changes that are being made, because it's important for people to know. So it's that balance.
Kjersti, in your introduction, you talked briefly about that we are influenced by a lot of different people from different sources. But in your opinion, and this question is to all three of you, who holds the power when it comes to opinion formation in the society?
It changes, it develops, and it's up for grab, I think. To answer the question in a stupid way, I think the newspaper that I read every day, always, of course, makes me either angry or annoyed or engaged, and I trouble my husband with opinions about it. Or it can be on messenger groups that no one knows that I'm part of, and it can be people that sort of, I think, are thought provocative, that I find thought provocative. And that is what I mean by it, that it will always be up for grab to take that position. And it's much more easy today, luckily, than it was before. Because in ancient newspaper times, you probably had to be invited to write columns every now and then for a week, for weeks or months, or if you were lucky, for years. But in the end, you would be pushed out in the cold, and you would be stripped of your audience, and you will have no voice no more. Today, you can start your own podcast, and that's beautiful. It's fun. It's wonderful. It's fantastic. And you don't either need to know an editor, or you don't need an editor at all to bring your message around. So and that is why I think that it's important that we shouldn't analyze the situation according to sort of stereotypes or foursquare labeling. That the fact that we used to have edited media only, I do think in some cases brings us preoccupied with edited media when we are analyzing the situation, and I think we should be much more aware of how we ourselves make up our minds and how we are informed through the day. And it's not always that we read the editor's note in the newspaper and starts from there.
Stefan, I know that you have done some research on this, on how opinion is made in the public. What are your thoughts on this? Who holds the power today when it comes to opinion formation?
That is a very difficult question, but in a sense, I think that journalism still has a very powerful position, but not an individual journalist, not an individual news outlet, but as a collective force. And as Kjersti, I think, as pointed out before, these herd tendencies that we've seen in the legacy media era, in a sense, might become weaker, but they still represent, on the one hand, a problem when there's these herd tendencies, but on the other hand, they bundle and focus the media's power to put issues on the agenda, maybe not determine what is being thought about these issues, but at least what issues are up for debate and from what angle to discuss them. And that is a very powerful position, because you basically know which political camps will come out on which side of the debate and with what arguments they will come forward. They just need something like a spectacle where they get as much of attention as they want for their issues. So I think this is still a very powerful position, and maybe the only set of actors that have this bundling power. Of course, there can be happenings that nobody can foresee that focus public attention so much. There can be political activities to some extent that can focus attention so much, but that always involves fundamental and substantial political efforts beyond just communicating politics. So I think both political actors who make substantial decisions and mass media as a collective have the power to put issues on the agenda, and that has foreseeable consequences on opinion formation. Not that you can persuade everyone, we see that ever more, that there's just very stubborn people. There's just very unpersuadable people. So there's nothing to be gained there. But putting something in the public arena does a lot for opinion formation. And if it's only learning the arguments of the different sides and exposing yourself to them.
Mm-hmm. So one aspect when it comes to the media's presentation of a case or an issue is the question of representation of opinions. So let's say that you are, or that a journalist or the media are covering a case about climate change. And although there are broad scientific agreement that climate change exists and is human-made, there are people who claim this to be false. Should journalists and the media aim for representation of opinions, even though some of them may be based on misinformation? What are your thoughts on this? Jenny?
I would say in that case, I would say no. And that's just because we have a so strong responsibility to present facts. Also, to gain the trust of the population, we have to present facts, and then you can contextualize it, you can put it in a context, you can explain who this is, you can explain why it's wrong, but then why would you put it in print in the first place? I don't think that we should be so afraid of the freedom of expression argument, if I could call it that, that we are willing to put the trust of our readers on stake. And I think that Norwegian media in more than before has done that the last few years. And I think we should be careful about putting directly false claims on print.
Kjersti, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I do. But I do think that when you, first of all, I don't think that you have any obligation to balance the matter of the story. That is confusion. But I think it's much more interesting to reflect deeper on not only which sources you choose, but how you explain them to the audience. And that has been a sort of thing that I've been critical to for a long time, because in Norway we have this expression kildekritikk, or critical of the sources, that is absolutely gives no meaning really. But I think it means in practice that you should reflect on the sources that you choose to bring in. And I do think that a lot of reporters do that they are deliberate and conscious when they choose their sources, but they never tell the audience why. So the why they choose this and this source is sort of a secret service in journalism. And I think if the newsroom and each and every journalist challenged themselves to sort of do that explanation, I'm bringing this one forward because he's had right 1,000 times before. Or he always say crazy stuff, and that makes a lot of energy in the text, which is often the reason why you pick the one. I think that sort of brings up a much more awareness of which sources you choose. And I mentioned specifically that because that source has had a right before, because in my favorite book that I think should be compulsory reading to all journalists, Thinking Fast and Slow, there is a passage on how to choose your sources, and the only meaningful way, he says, is that has he had right before? And that is an obvious reflection. Is this a good source? And I do think that if one did that consideration and looked back in the archives, I think that a few sources would sort of be ruled out.
So, as was mentioned, that some some voices might be excluded or not given a platform in order to keep the trust of the readers. But can there be, or can it lead to more distrust by excluding some voices of or opinions out there? What are your thoughts on this? I guess I'm directing the question to Jenny.
Yeah, some might claim that. I don't know. I'm not a scientist. I haven't researched this, but my sudden thought is no, I don't think so. The question is really, what you should reflect upon here is really, who are we risking and who are we pushing out? We don't have a responsibility to platform anyone. And I think that is something that we need to have in mind, that just because you have an opinion doesn't mean that we have an obligation to give you a platform to tell it. And I think that is a thought that many people have about the media, and often the argument used when people are talking about freedom of speech or something, that they didn't get freedom of speech because they weren't invited to speak in the media. And I think that is quite an uninteresting argument, if I'm going to be honest. It's like, if you hate the store Rema 1000, you can mean what you want about that. You can tell it to your friends, oh, I hate Rema 1000. I really hate Rema 1000. But you don't have any right to go into Rema 1000 and shout it out in the store. And it's kind of the same principle.
Stefan, I see that you have a comment.
Yes, I want to add to that. What Jenny is highlighting is the inherent need to be selective, and that's a very common misconception among news readers, that it would be the possibility to include everything. In Germany, we had a debate about whether to include the ethnic background in criminal cases. If you have like a very, very short note about a criminal case, does it have to say that the person is from what country whatsoever? And what people don't realize there is that this is only one of the thousands of elements you could include in each and every single crime story. And it's up to journalists to decide, is that relevant to the debate? And I think that's also key to getting this turmoil around media quality into a more nuanced debate, that we help citizens to understand the really hard and difficult decisions journalists are facing. And I think an interesting method or tool towards that could be that media have retrospects every now and then about major cases they have covered. Like if we look back in 1 year or so, when hopefully the corona crisis is over, we take a look back and reevaluate, how have we performed? Have we probably overplayed some things? Why have we done that? What happened here? What happened there? Where were we good? And so on. Something like a behind the scenes also, like how do we make the decisions in such important case? I think that would be interesting to readers if it's done in an honest fashion, and it would open up the debate to the real questions that journalists are facing, and that also we as a public are facing without knowing. So that's something I would hope we can work towards in the future.
So also in our age of technology, people are able to seek information from whatever source they want. And there has been a surge of alternative media sources. And that is, of course, a broad term, but I'm thinking about these news channels that are often linked to different political ideologies and claim to offer a different worldview, and also often include other sources than the traditional media often would. What do you see as challenges and benefits with this surge of alternative media? Kjersti?
To some extent, all competitors for attention are makes you reflect on your own work and should do also. And I do think that all serious reporters should reflect on why do they get attention, why do they get their audience, and why do they share the content? Because there is always, I might be wrong on this, but I do think that there is always a core of that is of relevance to your work in there, that you need to know and that you should spend some time reflecting on, and that you can learn from. And that is why I also think that it's dangerous to know platform people. I even think it was wrong to deplatform Donald Trump when he was still the president of the United States, even though he had behaved outrageous. But I think one should be, if there are sources that is not reliable, you should figure out if you are moralizing against the person, if you dislike the person, if you dislike him or her or whoever it is, that is not very professional. But still, they are interesting if they have audience. If they don't have audience, it's not that important at all. But if you sort of keep the platform open to them, if they have something to bring to the table that is of interest, I think you also keep yourself aware of that they are there. If you deplatform or cancel them, you sort of shut off your attention to them, and I think that might be wrong, and it might be not so gainful in the long term.
Mm-hmm. So we know that alternative media sources, it may impact the other more traditional news, but how does it impact us as individuals? Does it affect our opinions or views on the world? Stefan, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yes, so it's probably important as a first step to distinguish between singular observations that you can be making in extreme cases where individuals really get into a downward spiral by getting in some sort of what we call a filter bubble or an echo chamber, and the broader patterns that we can sketch. And from what we've seen in lots of different countries and studies that look for these processes, there doesn't seem to be much happening in terms of extremization of political views. Those people who expose themselves primarily to alternative media, they are relatively extreme in their political views to begin with, typically. And most others have a very broad information repertoire still. So they will be exposed to some of this, but often they will view that more as gossip or even more humorous things. They also follow, often they just follow things that they hate in order to be prepared for anything that's happening in debating such people, and just being aware of what's happening there. So there's a lot of different motivations, and we don't see a broad extremization effect as of now, at least not in the time intervals we've been looking at like weeks and months. Who knows what happens over years and years of cumulative exposure to such views.
Mm-hmm. The Reuters Digital News Report for 2020, it points out that highly polarized society also seems to have low levels of media trust. That is, whether or not they see the media as trustworthy and credible. Do you see that the media contribute to polarization, or are the distrust more a result of the already polarized and distrusted public?
Yeah, I definitely think it's an intricate relationship because, as you point out, it's certainly two-sided, and I would assume that there is other reasons why these societies are more polarized to begin with, and the lower media trust is an expression of that rather than the other way around. Though I don't want to exclude that the other relationship also exists, but for instance, the United States, there, I think the core root of the polarization we are seeing is very high social inequality and social variability in different regions and stuff like this. That is a severe problem, and many people resort to lower trust in institutions, media being one of them. As a result, but certainly there is a reciprocity.
Mm-hmm. Kjersti, do you have anything to add to this?
Just a few reflections. I think Turkey, which is a country that I'm head of Norwegian PEN, working for freedom of expression, and we have been a lot in Turkey and monitoring Turkey for many years. And what I've learned from the situation there is that when you put the media under pressure, they tend to change and become political. So the journalism evades, and the positioning takes place where there should be journalism, and that I think that is natural development, because you sort of fight for your right, and you become a counterforce to the government or the police or whatever. And what you see in the States also is that there are quite political medias, and when you are stuck with two parties, it's not that strange that you find the other some media is on your side and the others are not. And I do think that I do still think that even though Trump had lots of mistakes, the fact that he sort of were repeating this fake news as one meaning, that there were sort of not so reasonable angles to reporting. I think that made some of them better than they otherwise would have been, and that they also became more conscious on them being political in the reporting. But I very much agree with Stefan that I think we need to look far behind the media to find the real roots of divided societies, and I think it's important with I think education. The level of education is extremely important, and also that there is a widespread good hope for the future. I think that also is one of the background sort of forces for good society, and a society that is open to other opinions and other approaches to in the debate.
I think we will have to move on to some questions from the audience that we have gotten. So I'm going to start with a question from an anonymous person, and that is, how do we draw the ethical line between what sort of information should be allowed a platform as opposed to what should not? Jenny, as an working journalist, do you have any thoughts on this?
I think that is a difficult, you couldn't really draw a line. That's the easy and difficult answer. That is things we have to evaluate from time to time. But things that we think about when we're making a story is, does this add anything? Does this make the story better? Does it enlighten the debate? And if the answer is no, I think we draw the line there.
Do you have any other perspective on this, Stefan or Kjersti?
Yes, I can probably follow up. I agree with Jenny that it must be, in my opinion, about news judgment. So judging, for instance, regarding the climate change skeptics, I think it depends. For instance, if you have a local debate where you have some people who utter skeptical views like climate change probably isn't so bad, but look at those windmills, they look really horrible. I think that should get a voice because they are a party to the project or to the community that's directly affected. So it's important to know what they think. But just putting it in to have a balance and have two sides to an issue, even if you have 95 to 5% of scientists or even more, that can't be an argument. Yeah.
We have another question here from Jakob from Norway. Social media and the modern media market allows media houses to target specific demographics. We know that people are likely to click on and believe information that confirms their prior beliefs. How can media channels that try to be unbiased compete with channels that only want to generate clicks? Kjersti?
Well, I'm not sure, but what we have seen, and that I think is important, is that not only the last year with Corona, where we see a tremendous growth in subscription to serious news outlets, but lately for a few years, the established news media, there are no clickbaits anymore. That's ancient times. And we should stop talking about it because I think that's a phase they've been going through and left behind. What we see now is that the stories that are looked for, sought for, and paid for is what I think most of us will call serious value-adding reporting. But still, I think Jakob, who posted the question, is right that we are, as human beings, we tend to sort of approve to things that we already like or we already agree with, because we are humans. Before the last election in the US, The Guardian, I think, had a section where you could be exposed to opinions that you didn't have. And I decided I will go there every day to see, to challenge and develop, but I wasn't interested. So that's how we are, unfortunately.
We have a question here from Marit from Italy, and this is for the entire panel. So scientific research relies on peer reviewing, falsification, and replication in order to give a particular hypothesis merit. How do we distinguish between bad journalism and good journalism? What sort of criteria do you set? Jenny, how do you distinguish between bad and good journalism?
Yeah, that's hard to say. No, it's really about the sources we use, the methods we use, I would say. And I think that we as journalists also have to get better at explaining the readers what we do and why. Because even though we've seen lots of documents, we've maybe read like 500 pages of documents for one story, that doesn't always reflect in the material. And I think the whole media have a way to go there to explain the readers, what are we doing, why are we doing it, and also explain it in the story itself. Because right now, many see journalists as these mythical creatures, which they don't know how exactly works. And besides that, I think there is a problem now that many people don't have, they don't know how to recognize news and learn how to read news. And I'm especially worried about that in the generation that comes after me. Because when I grew up, paper was on the table every day, and I learned to read news through that. I had the paper issue, and I read that. And now you don't have the paper on the table anymore. You don't have these, you don't read the same news sources as your parents does. And I think we need to focus harder on how to get people to read news and how to learn to read news, because that is also something that is kind of its own thing. And if you never learn that, if you never learn how to recognize a news source versus a fake news source, that could be a problem.
Who has the responsibility to learn the younger generation these things? Is it the teachers or the parents themselves, the media perhaps?
I think it's all of us, but especially I think the media should be better at targeting content against young readers, because right now that for several years that has just been a group that we say, no, they don't read news, we don't prioritize them. And I think that is something that we need to change to not destroy ourselves.
Mm-hmm. We have a question here from Anonymous. Does the media often reflect the stereotypes and false notions that are widespread in society?
I think, I think there is a tendency to being stereotype or to replicate or to some default stuff that is working every day. And I think that very often boils down to you have short time, there's time pressure, there are few resources, you need to solve the question, you need to bring out the story. But I think it's what Stefan said previously, that the fact that you need to reflect, you should take 2 steps back and reflect now and then on what have you done lately. And for instance, I very much I enjoy the debate that Anke Gerhardsen, who is part of the Freedom of Expression Commission, has brought up recently on why has all reporters been so supportive to the corona strategy. And I think from day to day, it's logic. For one reporter, it's logic. But when you look at all the reporters all the time, then it's sort of awkward pattern. Why? And I think it's also interesting when you see today in Denmark, where there are lots of editor opinions asking for now you need to open the society again. You don't find that really in Norway yet. And what would be also stereotype or typical is that if you bring up a debate or a criticism like that, why is everyone so supportive? The next day they can be very negative. And that will also be sort of part of the there are some mechanisms, and one of the most common ones is the worse the better. And if you can make it even a little bit worse, that's also better, even though you think it's so bad that it's newsworthy. And that is also the paradox within journalism. that brings lots of stories forward and a lot of criticism that is no one then much more harsh than it needed to be.
And people who works in the media or as journalists, they, like everyone else, have their own opinions, experiences, and also biases that they take with them in their everyday life. Are journalists better to put those biases aside compared to other people, or at least more aware of it, do you think? Jenny, do you have any personal experience with this?
Yeah, you could say. I don't know if we're better at putting those things aside, but it's like you have to do a job. You can't expect me to not have an opinion. And everybody who meets me knows that I have an opinion, that I think things about in my own head about the things that are being discussed during the interview. And sometimes I think it actually makes us better because that means if you are unopinionated, you don't have any questions to ask. You don't have any way to challenge people. And there is a difference between not having an opinion and being objective. And I experienced that all journalists in Norway really are objective when reporting, and that is another notion than not having an opinion.
Kjersti?
Every year there is a poll that is published on the Nordic Media Days in Bergen, stating the same thing every year, namely that if the Norwegian Parliament was inhabited only by journalists, the government of today would not be possible. So the sort of left-wing orientation of the journalists are repeated every year, and there has been a reluctancy for many years to not talk about that, because I do think because journalists feel that they handle this in their reporting every day, and I think I very much agree with what Jenny says on that matter also. But I think it would be sort of comforting for the audience that the media as such took the debate, that they not really took it off the table, but sort of related to what everyone sees and what it's very logic to ask as a question from the audience. Why doesn't this reflect the reporting if it's so biased? That I every year think that it's important to discuss it. It's important to take it serious, because I think it's important to the audience.
Mm-hmm. We have a question here from Anonymous. So the technology that can produce deepfakes is improving at an alarming rate. How do you think this will impact the information ecosystem? So a little bit different topic than what we have talked about earlier. But Stefan, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yes. So what I think is that for most people, this will raise their levels of scrutiny and criticism. So they will be very soon, they will be aware of this phenomenon if it gains traction and gets more and more popular and widespread. And I think the big mainstream of society will be very aware, and if they view things that they don't think are really plausible to have happened, they will dismiss or at least be very skeptical about it. And on the other hand, you have the already sensitized people who have a tendency to believe in something like this and also want to believe in something like that, not because they don't recognize that it's maybe strange, but because it caters to their psychological needs in a sense, and they will use it as ammunition in trying to persuade others, or at least reinforcing their beliefs. So I think, although of course that's just speculation, I think that's a likely course of what's happening. So we have a lot of very educated and reflected people, but we also have people who lack that level of reflection, or who want to believe in these deep fakes because they cater to their side, and they will have an easy time figuring out on the other side of the political spectrum that that's just fake, but on their side of the political spectrum they will buy it. So I fear that's one more process that contributes to segmenting the public sphere. Not a large part of the public sphere, but getting some people out and us losing contact with them. I fear that might be the case.
Mm-hmm. Are there other actions that can be made to increase the audience ability to critical thinking for the information they are presented? Stefan?
Yeah, I think that ability is already relatively high. I think one problem that Jenny has already pointed out is that the younger generation needs to familiarize themselves with the way news are typically looking and the patterns that are characteristic for it, because that is something very much underlying our judgments, whether this sounds real, whether this sounds like it's news or not. That would be highly problematic if that gets lost. And if we, but I think right now, most people have a quite good intuition of what's suspect. In a sense, in fake news. And often I think those who don't realize or buy what's in fake news, it's not because they don't realize that it's probably suspect, but they want to believe it.
Kjersti?
I think the question of deep fake is a really disturbing one, and it has can cause collateral damage to media, because now and then someone will succeed in getting information published and have success in coming through the edited channels. And I'd like to remind you about the movie that was made of a Norwegian movie maker, the Syrian Boy, if you remember. It went viral globally. Showed a boy that rescued a girl from the crossfire, but it was all made up. It was just a story. It was filmed in a studio, and that are examples that those are real dangers to the edited media. You cannot have many of those before the audience would be very cautious. But still, the fact that we now know that a lot of information that we can find on social media are just crap is making us much more cautious, I think, to a lot of information, which is not wrong. It's just that it's very exhausting.
We have a question from Karim from Egypt. How can we avoid the misleading media? I don't know if any of you feel the call to answer, Stefan?
Yes, the very easy answer is to rely on established media brands. I mean, it's probably the biggest capital also that news organizations still have. And as Kjersti has pointed out, having realized that clickbait isn't a good strategy to move into the future, because it damages your brand. So I think that's important, but it will only help as long as news organizations have a business model that sustains them And here in Norway, we are probably relatively lucky with a relatively high likelihood that people will pay for news content, but that's not commonplace around the world. And advertising won't pay for news journalism in the long run, I fear. And so I think the biggest challenge is to find a business model for the future that is sustainable for journalism as we know it, or how it evolves out of what we know. Because I think it will change, and it will change to a large extent, and not everything must be bad. So there were things in the old media world that didn't work very well. We talked about sources. There's very good mechanisms in source choice, but it also leads to a big concentration on powerful, influential, resourceful actors, and marginalization of other voices. So not everything is by itself necessary to maintain. So I think it will change, but something will evolve from there, and it needs a sustainable business model.
We have another question here from Anonymous. Should the media censor information which challenges the status quo on a particular topic? Kjersti?
Well, the media is sort of censoring things all the time, but we call it editing. And and there is this, when something is newsworthy and something is not. I think Jenny touched upon it very well in her introduction. It's a sort of X factor. Sometimes you find it newsworthy, sometimes you don't. It depends on if you find something you can add to it or not. But you will never find I think a serious newsroom that systematically censor an approach to things, and no, you should not do it either.
Are there some times or in some cases where it's beneficial to hold back information in the news?
Well, the most recent example I come up with now is the knowledge that there was a lady missing outside Oslo for many months without the newsrooms telling about it. And I think when those things happen, where you are sort of asked not to bring things forward, it's difficult afterwards. It's difficult when you know something that you don't tell the audience. That's very complicated.
Mm-hmm. I have a question here from Jenny from Norway. I guess it's another Jenny, and it's something that we touched upon earlier regarding which voice or not to portray in the media. And I'm sorry about that. I'm gonna jump to the question. It's about the person who denies climate change. So if the person who does not, for example, believe in climate change has had right before, what to do then? Is it then right to put his or her voice out in the media? So I think it's about what I think you, Kjersti, mentioned, that if someone had right before.
Well, yeah, but it also depends on the arguments in the specific case, or the statements as such. And I think we should be aware of that not all climate scientists do agree on how things are. The UN climate panel, they're not speaking with one voice. I think that will be to report on climate change will be trustworthy if we let a variety of voices brought forward. I think it was an interesting thing that happened to me this week was on Saturday NRK, there was a a story on a vegetarian blogger. She experienced a lot of hate speech, as I understood it, from meat lovers, and it's very easy to think that those are uninformed and sort of primates, or not. Yeah, they're not so good people, not informed. But then 3 days later, I read a long story on NRK that scientists do now disagree whether meat is unhealthy or not, and that suddenly changes those who object to vegetarianism. One thing is that you can argue against the climate changes of meat, but the other thing is it unhealthy to eat meat? And I think we should be aware of that things are changing. The Earth was flat, and now it's round, and that can happen. Not so huge changes, but very often we get new insight, we get new knowledge, and things are changing. And that's why I think we do wise in sort of listen and reflect and not be too categoric in meeting people that have different opinions.
Mm-hmm. We are soon coming to an end for this plenary session, but I will take one last question from the audience. With the constant news cycle and the faster rate at which information is being produced nowadays, does this affect the quality of the information we get? Stefan?
Yes, I think that can be a tremendous problem. Also because in the newsrooms, focus is very much on getting the information out, getting the information probably not out first, but the basic unit of news is no longer the day. Right? And you don't really know when people are accessing the news platforms. So it might be that quite a lot of your readers are not seeing an entire news cycle, right? So even news that are very prominent in quite a lot of outlets might be that particular people with maybe untypical news use patterns miss that. And so I think that is quite a problem in amassing public awareness for issues, for fundamental issues that really require also maybe more long-term or at least mid-term public attention, also to exert pressure on political decision makers. So as if the public is no longer aware and does no longer keep track of these issues for a longer period of time, that can be a problem. Though it doesn't seem at this time to be as big a problem with the most prominent news. So everybody will see that coronavirus is a big issue because it's been going on for 1 year and longer. So that's not to be missed, but other things might go missing.
Jenny?
Yeah, I absolutely think that it could affect the quality of what we produce, especially when we are competing. We are competing against other newspapers about producing the news, and we move fast and we publish fast, and then we can discover later that we have made mistakes. So I think the most important thing, and we also talk about this a lot, what happens when we move fast, we make decisions fast, we make mistakes sometimes, and then we have to correct those mistakes and explain why did we do that mistake, how can we change that the next time so we don't do it again, and also make it clear to the readers that we made a mistake, we've corrected it, here you are.
Thank you. I believe that has to be the last word for today. Thank you so much, Stefan Geiss, Kjersti Løken Stavrum, and Jenny Westrum-Rein for joining us today and sharing your knowledge with us. I also want to thank those of you in the audience who asked questions. And I want to thank the groups working here at the Student Society who have contributed to making this digital plenary session possible, which is Videokomiteen, Forsterkerkomiteen, Fotogjengen, Regi, Vertskapet, and Sikring. Thank you for watching ISFiT plenary session, Controlling the Narrative. I wish you all a good and knowledgeable evening. Good night.